The morning my father-in-law Gideon was ready to be discharged from the hospital in Parry Sound, every single member of my wife's family discovered a problem that absolutely couldn't wait. My brother-in-law Blake had a site inspection he couldn't reschedule. My sister-in-law Lorena had a PTA commitment she had apparently forgotten about until that exact morning. And my wife Vera, the woman who had spent 2 weeks telling everyone how worried she was about her father, was standing at the kitchen counter in her housecoat at 6 in the morning, explaining to me that she had a migraine coming on and could feel it behind her left eye. I poured myself a coffee, set the mug down on the counter, and listened to all of it without saying a single word. I spent 32 years as a senior fraud investigator for a major insurance company. That career had one central skill. You learn to watch people's behavior, not their words. When someone explains too much, when the timing of their excuse lines up just a little too perfectly, when they avoid your eyes while describing their sudden and catastrophic scheduling emergency, you file that away. You don't react, you observe. I picked up my keys, kissed Vera on the cheek, and drove north on the 400. Gideon was 88 years old. He'd had a fall at his property near Parry Sound 3 weeks earlier, a bad one down the back steps of the cottage he'd owned for over 40 years. The paramedics found him in the yard at night. His hip was fractured and his shoulder was badly bruised. He'd been alone. The drive took 2.5 hours. I had too much time with my own thoughts. The highway unspooling through granite and spruce, the kind of landscape that makes you feel very small and very honest. By the time I pulled into the hospital parking lot, I'd run through the pattern of events in my wife's family many times over. When Gideon had paid for Blake's roofing business to get off the ground 11 years ago, both siblings had been at his side constantly. When Lorena needed her kitchen renovated and her HELOC was maxed out, Gideon wrote a check without being asked twice. When Vera had wanted to upgrade our car and felt embarrassed to tell me, she'd gone to her father first. But 220 kilometers of highway to pick up a man with a fractured hip, suddenly everyone had somewhere to be. I found him in a wheelchair near the discharge desk, a nurse organizing his paperwork beside him. He looked fragile in a way that squeezed something in my chest. The bruising along his jaw had faded to a dull yellow, and he moved carefully, like a man who had learned in the worst way possible that his body would no longer tolerate carelessness. But when he looked up and saw me walk through those doors, his eyes were clear. Not the watery, unfocused eyes I'd been bracing for. Sharp, watchful. The nurse handed me the discharge forms on a clipboard. She smiled at me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You must be Frederick," she said. "We're glad someone could make it." I signed where she indicated. Did his family check in much while he was here? She hesitated just a fraction of a second. His son called a few days ago. He didn't ask how Gideon was doing. He wanted to know whether any legal documents had been signed during the admission, whether there was any medical power of attorney on file. I stopped writing. "He seemed very interested in the paperwork side of things," she added carefully. I thanked her, took the handles of the wheelchair, and pushed Gideon toward the exit. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. The parking lot was cold. Late October in cottage country has a particular bite to it. The air smells like pine and frost and the particular melancholy of a season closing down. I helped Gideon into the passenger seat, buckled his belt, folded the wheelchair back to the rental desk, and walked around to the driver's side. The moment I closed my door, the world outside went quiet. "Ready to head home, Gideon?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He stared through the windshield at the parking lot for a long moment. Then he turned toward me, and the careful, frail performance he'd been giving the nurses dissolved in an instant. His posture changed. He reached out and put his hand on my arm. His grip was still strong. "Don't take me to the house," he said. His voice was low and deliberate. "Drive to Mr. Ostrowski's office in Barry. Don't call Vera. Don't tell anyone. Just drive." I put the truck in gear and pulled out of the lot. We drove south for nearly 20 minutes in silence. I know better than to push. In fraud investigation, you learn that if you let the silence sit long enough, people fill it themselves, and they fill it honestly. He spoke first. "My fall wasn't an accident, Frederick." My hands tightened on the wheel. "Blake and Lorena came to the cottage that evening," he said, his voice quiet and even, the way people speak when they've been rehearsing something for weeks just to stay sane. "They didn't call first. Blake had papers, a transfer deed for the property. He said he needed it to secure a loan, that he was going to lose his business if I didn't sign that night. Lorena was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. He paused. I watched the road. I told him no. I told him I wasn't signing anything that night, not without my lawyer looking at it first. Blake, he stopped. He took a slow breath. He's my son. I kept telling myself that while he was screaming at me across my own kitchen table, he grabbed my arm when I tried to walk to the phone. I lost my balance. I went down the back steps. Another pause, longer this time. I heard them leave. I heard the car start. I lay on the ground for a long time before I managed to get close enough to the road that someone could hear me. I stared at the highway and felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. They called 911, he said, from somewhere else. Told the dispatcher they'd heard something and weren't sure. They didn't stay. By the time we reached Barry, I had stopped feeling shock. What replaced it was the familiar, clarifying cold of a fraud case clicking into shape. Mr. Ostrowski's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, the kind of place with no signage beyond a small brass plate. He had been Gideon's solicitor for over 25 years, a compact, gray-haired man who spoke slowly and precisely and never wasted a syllable. When we arrived, he was already waiting. He didn't offer small talk. He closed the blinds, locked the office door, and sat behind his desk. He slid a folder across to me. Blake had filed for adult guardianship 3 days after Gideon was admitted to hospital. The application claimed that Gideon was suffering from severe cognitive decline, that the fall had been the result of an acute episode, that he could no longer manage his finances or his daily care. Blake had obtained a supporting assessment from a physician whose name didn't appear anywhere in the provincial medical registry. I checked on my phone while Ostrowski was talking. The plan was clean, in a grim sort of way. If guardianship was granted, Blake would have legal control over Gideon's person and his finances. The cottage, 42 acres of lakefront property north of Parry Sound, the kind of land that developers had been circling for a decade, could be sold. And once it was sold, it would be gone. If you take him home tonight, Ostrowski said, Blake will call the OPP and present the guardianship order. They'll have no choice but to act on it. Gideon will be placed in a facility under his son's authority before morning. I looked at the man who had built that cottage with his own hands in his 40s and had hosted 30 years of family summers on that lake. He was sitting straight in the chair, his jaw set, his eyes dry. How do we stop it? I asked. Ostrowski leaned forward. We don't stop it by defending. We make the application irrelevant. I drove Gideon to a corporate extended-stay hotel on the south edge of the city. The kind of place where nobody asks questions, where business travelers come and go without interest in each other. I paid for a week in cash and registered under a name that meant nothing to anyone. I stocked the room with groceries, soup, crackers, ginger ale, the kind of easy food you bring someone who's healing. I helped Gideon settle into the armchair by the window and watched the tension in his shoulders ease slightly, for the first time since I'd picked him up. You're safe here, I told him. Nobody knows this address. Ostrowski is working on the legal side. I'll handle the rest. He looked at me for a long moment. What does the rest mean, Frederick? It means I'm going home, I said, and pretending I don't know anything. The drive back was the longest 40 minutes of my life. I was rehearsing the version of myself I needed to be. Tired, slightly frustrated, the kind of man who'd had a long day and just wanted dinner and sleep. Not the man who had spent the afternoon learning that his wife's family had left an 88-year-old man lying on the ground outside his own cottage in the dark. I was 2 streets from home when Vera called. I let it ring twice, then I answered. Frederick, where are you? Her voice was tight, not worried. Tight, where is Dad? The hospital called and said he was discharged hours ago. The drive wore him out, I said. My voice came out even, which surprised me. He had a dizzy spell on the way home. I didn't want to risk it. I took him to a walk-in clinic on the east side of Barry to get checked out. They want to monitor his blood pressure for a few hours. I'm waiting across the street. Silence, not the silence of relief, the silence of calculation. Which clinic? She asked. Bayview Medical on Essa Road, I said. I'd invented it on the drive. 2nd floor, room 4. You should have called me immediately. Her voice had shifted, softer now, performing concern. I'll stay here and rest. Just keep me updated. Don't move him without telling me. She hung up. I pulled over and made a U-turn. I parked across from a strip mall on Essa Road that had no medical clinic anywhere in it, killed my headlights, and sat in the dark with the engine off. I watched the clock on my dashboard. I prayed, in the foolish way you pray when you already know the answer, that the lot would stay empty, that I was wrong about my wife. 19 minutes later, Blake's truck came around the corner doing 30 over the limit. He cut across the lot, parked at an angle, and got out with a folder under his arm. He tried 3 different storefronts before he stood in the cold, phone to his ear, pacing back and forth under the parking lot lights. I watched him for a while. Then I drove home. Vera was on the sofa with her tea when I came in. The lights low, the picture of a woman nursing a headache. I hung up my jacket. I told her the clinic wanted to keep Gideon overnight as a precaution, that his blood pressure had spiked during discharge, that we could pick him up tomorrow afternoon. The relief on her face was immediate and profound. She sighed and put her hand over her heart and said it was better to be safe than sorry. She was relieved because she'd just bought Blake another 24 hours. I went to bed. I did not sleep. I lay in the dark beside my wife of 31 years and listened to her breathing slow, and I thought about the fact that she had called her brother the moment I gave her that address. Not to ask if her father was all right, to hand Blake the location. At 2 in the morning, when her breathing had settled into the deep, even rhythm of real sleep, I got up. Vera's home office was at the end of the hall. Her committee work, her household filing, her book club correspondence, and apparently the quiet administration of a family conspiracy. I closed the door behind me and sat at her desk in the dark. I didn't turn on the overhead light. I worked by the glow of her monitor. I had spent 32 years following the financial trails that people believed they had hidden. Bank records, wire transfers, shell accounts. People always think the paperwork vanishes when they delete the file. It doesn't. The ghost stays until something overwrites it, and in most home computers, nothing ever does. Vera used the same password she'd used for everything since 2003. Our wedding anniversary followed by our old postal code. I plugged in the encrypted drive I kept in my jacket pocket, old habit from the investigation years, and let the recovery software run while I pulled up her banking history. The first anomaly surfaced within 4 minutes. Our joint RRSP, we'd been building it since our early 30s, the slow and patient accumulation of a retirement neither of us expected to be glamorous. Starting 8 months ago, there had been a series of withdrawals, 12,000 in February, 18 in April, 22,000 in June, and again in August. Total $68,000. I traced the routing. It went through a numbered company, the kind of shell incorporation that takes an afternoon to set up and looks legitimate until you pull one layer back. The destination account belonged to a criminal defense law firm in Barrie. I opened the recovered files. The folder was labeled Reno Estimates. Inside it were letters from the Canada Revenue Agency. Blake's roofing and construction business had been under audit for 6 years. The CRA had identified systematic underreporting of income, fabricated subcontractor expenses, and a series of transfers that had no legitimate business purpose. The total assessed liability, back taxes, interest, and penalties, was just under $2 million. Blake had received a final notice of intent to pursue criminal prosecution for tax evasion. The only path away from a criminal indictment was a full settlement, paid in full, before the CRA filed formally. And there was only one asset in the family worth anything close to $2 million. 42 acres of lakefront property that hadn't been on the market since Gideon had built his first dock on it in 1981. Vera had known about the CRA investigation for at least 8 months. She had been draining our retirement savings to fund her brother's legal defense, quietly and systematically, while asking me each evening how my day had gone. I unplugged the drive, turned off the monitor, and sat in the dark for a long time. Then I went back to bed. The next afternoon I found a Tim Hortons at the edge of town and sat in a corner booth with a large double-double and called Ostrowski. I told him everything, the RSP withdrawals, the CRA file, the criminal exposure driving Blake's desperation. Ostrowski was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That changes our timeline considerably. He can't wait for the estate. He needs liquid cash before November, or he's facing federal charges." 3 days after that, I went to the grocery store. The parking lot was gray and half empty, the kind of November afternoon that feels like the world has already moved on to something else. I loaded 2 bags into the back seat and reached for my door handle. A dark pickup came around the building faster than it had any reason to and stopped hard, blocking me in from behind. Wade got out. He was Lorena's husband, a contractor himself, heavyset, The kind of man who fills a room with noise rather than presence. He crossed the lot with his hands loose at his sides and stopped 2 feet from me. No greeting, no pretense. "Where is he?" said. I didn't answer. "You don't understand what you're sitting in the middle of," he said. He lowered his voice, which somehow made it worse. "Blake used my equipment yard as collateral for his bridge loan. If this deal doesn't close, the bank takes my trucks, my whole yard, everything I've built for 15 years. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath. "I'm telling you plainly, walk away. Let this happen. Because when people are losing everything," he paused and let it settle. "Accidents happen to the people who get in the way. You take my meaning." I understood exactly what he meant. I also knew that the dashcam mounted behind my rearview mirror had been recording since the moment his truck pulled into my sightlines. Wide-angle lens, built-in microphone. I'd had it installed 3 years ago after a fender-bender dispute and hadn't thought much about it since. "Are you finished, Wade?" I asked. He stared at me. Then he went back to his truck and drove away. I sat in my truck for a moment and synced the footage to my encrypted cloud account. Then I drove to Ostrowski's office and showed him the video. He watched it twice. Then he said, "We're ready." The document we drafted that evening was a work of elegant fiction. On the surface, it read like a surrender, a transfer deed for the cottage property, conditional only on Blake withdrawing the guardianship petition. Ostrowski used language thick with legal authority, the kind of weight that makes a greedy person stop reading and start celebrating. The bait had to feel found, not handed over, so I delivered it myself. I called Vera the next morning and let my voice carry the particular exhaustion of a man who has run out of will to fight. I asked if we could meet somewhere quiet. She chose a coffee shop near the house and arrived in dark glasses, arms crossed, braced for another argument. I pushed the folder across the table without ceremony. I told her Gideon was frightened and worn down, that Ostrowski had drafted a preliminary settlement, that the cottage would be transferred, that we just needed Blake to drop the legal proceedings first. No police involvement, no psychiatric hold, nothing hanging over anyone's head while papers were signed. I watched her open the folder. I watched the precise moment the arithmetic of her brother's salvation became real between her hands. She looked up at me, and there was something in her expression that might have been pity, or might have been triumph, and I couldn't tell which was worse. She patted my hand across the table. She said I was doing the right thing. She walked out of that coffee shop holding the folder the way someone carries a winning lottery ticket, carefully, close to the body, already planning what comes next. 2 days later, Ostrowski received the automated notification from the court registry. Blake had formally withdrawn the adult guardianship petition. The supporting medical assessment was canceled. The OPP had no further legal authority to act on any order. My phone rang 20 minutes after. Vera sounded warm for the first time in weeks. She said Blake had agreed to drop everything because he simply wanted peace. She said he had booked a meeting room at the provincial courthouse in Barrie for Friday morning to finalize the transfer. Perfect neutral ground, she called it. Blake had booked a room in a building full of lawyers and court officers to commit the greatest theft of his life, and he thought the formal marble setting would keep us quiet and compliant. He had no idea what was waiting for him at that table. Friday morning was clear and cold, the sky that particular pale blue that only shows up in Ontario in November when the humidity has finally broken. Gideon didn't use the wheelchair. He walked into the courthouse on his own, his cane tapping the marble floor, his jaw set in the way I had come to recognize as his version of armor. They were already seated when we came in. Blake, Lorena, and Vera on the far side of the conference table. Blake was in a new suit. He leaned back in his chair with his hands folded together, projecting the easy authority of a man who believed he had already won and was simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. Vera looked up when I entered. She gave me the careful, managing smile of a woman who had already written the next chapter in her head. She said she was glad we could all sit down together like adults. No hard feelings. Lorena didn't quite meet Gideon's eyes. Blake slid the transfer deed across the table and set an expensive pen on top of it. He said he was just glad they could finally do right by their father. That managing a property of that size was too much stress for a man of Gideon's age. That this was family taking care of family. I sat very still and let him talk. In fraud investigation, you always let them talk. When Blake finally ran out of words, I opened Ostrowski's briefcase and pulled out the first set of documents. "These are CRA assessment records," I said. "Yours, 6 years of underreported income, fabricated subcontractor invoices, offshore transfers the CRA flagged in the first month of audit, $1.9 million in outstanding liability, criminal indictment pending." Blake's face went the color of old concrete. I pulled out the second set. "These are transaction records from Vera's home computer." I set them in front of my wife. "Reading numbers, withdrawal dates, destination accounts, $68,000 moved from our joint RRSP over 8 months, transferred through a numbered company directly into your brother's criminal defense fund." Vera's hands were flat on the table, perfectly still. "You didn't delete everything," I said. "People never do." Lorena made a small, involuntary sound. She had turned to look at her brother. Blake slammed his hand on the table. He said the CRA matter was separate. He said the guardianship petition was still valid. He said he would— "The petition was withdrawn Thursday morning," Ostrowski said. His voice was quiet and precise. "On your instruction, you traded your only legal instrument for a document you believed would give you the property." He reached across and picked up the transfer deed. He held it up briefly, the way you hold something before you let it go. Then he tore it cleanly in half. Blake lurched forward. Ostrowski set the pieces down on the polished table without hurrying. "There is a structural problem with the deed," Ostrowski said. "To transfer a property, the transferor must own it, and Gideon has not owned this property for 3 years." The room went quiet. Ostrowski continued without rushing. 3 years ago, Gideon had come to his office, carrying a concern he'd been weighing for some time. He had watched his children's finances deteriorate. He had watched the requests become more frequent and more urgent. He was a careful man, and careful men plan before the crisis arrives. He had transferred the entirety of his estate, the cottage, the land, all financial accounts held in his name, into an irrevocable trust. The word irrevocable was not incidental. It could not be undone. It could not be contested by unhappy relatives. It could not be seized by federal creditors pursuing tax debt. It existed in a legal form that none of Blake's filings, none of his fake medical assessments, none of his guardianship petitions could touch. The trust required a sole trustee, someone with a spotless financial history, someone who understood complex structures, someone who could not be manipulated by family pressure into decisions that served the wrong people. I folded my hands on the table. Blake was staring at me. His mouth was open. "There is nothing here for you," I said. "There was never anything here for you. You left your father in the yard of his own home in the dark and drove away, and then you spent 3 weeks building a legal fiction about his mental state to steal an asset that was never yours to take." Blake's composure broke entirely. He was on his feet, pointing at me, his voice rising to something I had never heard from him, something that lived between rage and genuine terror. He said the land was his family's legacy. He said he had rights. He said when desperate people were truly backed against a wall. Ostrowski opened a second envelope and slid it across the table. Inside were copies of everything already delivered to the relevant authorities that morning. The fabricated guardianship affidavit, the dashcam footage of Wade in the parking lot, the falsified medical assessment from an unlicensed physician. Both the OPP and the CRA had received packages before 9 a.m. Lorena stood up so fast her chair scraped back against the wall. She turned on Blake and said she had never known the CRA was involved. She said he'd told her it was a cash flow problem. She said she hadn't known about the criminal charges and that he had used her. Her voice cracked wide open. Blake told her she'd known exactly what she was doing, and she had best remember that before she started pointing fingers. In 30 seconds, the alliance between them had dissolved completely into something ugly and irreparable. I didn't watch the rest of it. I reached into my jacket pocket and set a folded document in front of Vera. "Divorce papers," I said, "attached to a civil claim for the $68,000. She looked at me. The careful, managing expression was entirely gone. What replaced it was something raw and small. "Frederick, you made a choice," I said. "You sat in a darkened room and let your father be carried to a hospital 3 hours away, and you made your choice. I'm not interested in the explanation." I stood. Ostrowski had already closed his briefcase with a clean final click. I walked around the table and offered my arm to Gideon. He took it without a word, without glancing back at the 3 people still seated on the other side, without offering a single syllable to the children who had left him lying on the ground outside his own home. He rose, adjusted his grip on his cane, and walked with me toward the door. I pulled it shut behind us. The hallway outside was cool and completely quiet, the sounds from the room we'd just left absorbed by the thick doors and the high ceilings. We walked slowly down the corridor. Gideon's cane tapped a steady rhythm on the floor. We took the elevator to the lobby and pushed through the heavy doors into the November afternoon. The air outside was cold and sharp and entirely clean, the kind of air that doesn't apologize for itself. The courtyard was nearly empty. A few pigeons, a woman walking a dog on a long lead, and the two of us standing there for a moment, not going anywhere in particular. I looked at Gideon. He was looking at the sky. After a while, he said, "Is there a good place to get some soup around here?" "I know a place," I said. We walked to my truck without rushing, and I did not look back at the building behind us. Blood doesn't make a family. I spent 32 years tracking the specific kind of person who understands that fact and uses it as a weapon, who looks at the word family and sees an instrument of access, a reason someone will look the other way, a door that stays unlocked because nobody wants to believe what's standing on the other side of it. I had been that unlocked door for a long time. I had watched the small manipulations and told myself they were the ordinary friction of any family, that loyalty required a certain amount of tolerance, that the cost of confrontation was always higher than the cost of letting things go. But silence doesn't protect you from people who are already counting your assets. It just gives them more time to make a cleaner plan. The hardest thing I ever did was not the legal maneuvering, not the late nights with the recovery software, not the performance of normalcy I maintained for Vera while the evidence stacked up around me. The hardest thing was accepting that the version of my marriage I had believed in for 3 decades had been, in some essential way, a fiction held together by my own willingness not to look too closely. What you lose when you finally look clearly is the comfort of the story you told yourself. What you gain is something quieter and harder and worth considerably more than any property in Muskoka. You gain the knowledge that when it truly mattered, you did not look away. That the person who needed protecting was protected. That you stood in the room where every advantage had been arranged against you, and you did not flinch once. That is the only inheritance worth anything, and no one can file a petition to take it from you.